So I'll hand straight over to Peter Newborne, who will be our discussant. He's an independent consultant and research associate to ODI. He previously spent 8 years with the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, working on sustainable development projects, and prior to that was a legal advisor working on building and engineering contracts and infrastructure projects. Peter.
Yeah, thank you. So my task is to respond particularly to the presentation just made by Roger on WASH, but to extend it to larger examples of infrastructure, including hydro and dams for hydroelectrical generation or other uses. What I'm going to try to do is, we had the privilege of a presentation from the Minister of Transport. I'm going to try and put myself into the shoes of a Minister of Water in an African country. I say. I think they're fairly hot shoes, actually, after the presentations we've just heard, with words like a high degree of uncertainty, volatility, flashiness. So I think there's some issues, but starting from the point that Roger's made of business as usual plus better, I think that's a good starting point for water people who are used to these notions of variation, spatial and temporal variation. I'm going to just pick up a few points, one on information, secondly on options assessment and development choices, which I think was mentioned in your report, Lily. This notion of built-in redundancy you referred to, Roger, which I think needs thinking about, and then very quickly on cost and also a point on capacity. I mentioned hydro. One of the issues, of course, in Africa is a huge deficit in terms of access to electricity. The figures are something around, according to the International Energy Agency, 31% of people currently have access. That compares with the water supply figures, which are estimated at 37%. I think actually practical action has quoted a much lower figure for electricity access. So you can see in Africa there's demand for energy and water. In terms of information, one thing that occurs to me, I mean, after reading the reports, which set out very frankly and clearly some of the gaps in information, as a minister I would want to get obviously the best information available, but surely the key is that information is interpreted and analysed objectively, and that seems to me to require interrogating that evidence so that the experts have the opportunity to effectively admit when it's very difficult to make projections which are at all precise. I mean, I think that's very important, that you don't brush over uncertainties and produce recommendations to ministers which are essentially misleading. I mean, I think you have to grasp this uncertainty, and then, as you say, you have to build it into your planning, your policy and your planning and your projects. I think there's probably some engineers in the room who will no doubt be able to help with the latter. So that's the first point. I think often the peer review and the way consultancies are structured doesn't really help in airing these issues fully. The second issue is about options assessment. It's 10 years since the World Commission on Dams, which proposed a very open and broad stakeholder approach to options assessment for large dams and other infrastructure projects. But I mean, in the decades since, it's fairly clear that has been a weak element in terms of take up by government, perhaps for some obvious reasons. I also took the opportunity of doing a word search on this document, 400 pages. I found 18 mentions of climate change. Well, I think 10 years later, one would expect many, many more than that. So it shows how much the agenda has moved on. And I think things are getting better in terms of protocols and assessment tools. This is an example of a hydropower assessment, the Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol, which has been produced by a sort of multi-stakeholder group published by the International Hydropower Association. I mean, this does put climate change on the radar in terms of how the hydrological resource and management of reservoirs, but tends still to assume that kind of detailed assessment of climate change is the most demanding, the best standard of practice, whereas common practice would ask a hydrologist to factor in climate change in projections of river flows. So I question whether that is sufficient. But anyway, things are moving in the right direction.
5 minutes.
I think in terms of options assessment, I very much agree with the basic argument put forward in a 2009 report called Charting Our Water Futures, which was sponsored by the 2030 Water Resources Group and written by McKinsey. I mean, the basic thesis they put forward is that governments have to make choices. You cannot simply pile into a particular location, industry, sector upon sector. You have to make development choices between different options. So if you're the mayor of a coastal town in Bali, which I understand has a number of water problems, you cannot simply assume that you can attract 5-star hotels, a bottling plant for a multinational drinks and beverage group, other industries, and satisfy local farmers, and be sure that the jobs that those people have in hotels and businesses are matched by water supply when they go home. If you simply pile on development planning without any regard to the degree of access you are according, Roger mentioned this, according to the water resource, and without basing your decisions on information in that regard, you are storing up major problems for yourself. And the McKinsey report, I think, is very good on the need for, they say, top-level political support to facilitate essentially what the WCD proposed, which is assessment of options, choices between different development pathways, which is obviously very important in the case of sectors which use a significant amount of water. I mean, that's the focus of this particular occasion. So the other thing I was going to talk about is this issue of robust for uncertainty. What does that mean? And in your report, Roger, you talk about built-in redundancy. Now, what does that mean? I mean, I suppose one example, and the engineers here may correct me, is that Basil Jett, when he designed, and his colleagues designed the London sewers, I understand made the spec, the engineering specification, very ample. And 100 years later, the sewers were still functioning. I understand they do not function so well now. But that was an example, I believe, of an engineer who took into account the unforeseen and built those sewers so they didn't have to be retrofitted later. Now, that's one example, I presume, of building in redundancy. Query the cost of that. The other thing, I suppose, in water points in rural areas is to ensure there's overlaps between different water points. So if one supply is depleted, there is access. I think the other issue is flexibility in terms of, again, according access rights to water resources, to draw water from groundwater or from surface waters. Surely a Minister of Water should be careful not to grant the available supply up to the last cubic meter. There must be flexibility, and I think there are examples, for example, in Australia, of moves to grant access rights on the basis of proportional rights rather than specific volumes, with regular review of the state of the resource, essentially. And I think so that's another, surely, key word is flexibility, so you don't become locked in. I think, Lily, you mentioned locked in. You don't become locked in to situations as the minister you cannot get out of 10, 20 years ahead. In the hydro context, that's surely an example of that would be where you sign up a contract, or you're the chief of your electricity agency signs a contract for power takeoff from a hydro plant without actually being sure what river flows there will be to power your turbines, and putting so much pressure on the reservoir that other uses are deprived of access, including, of course, water supply for rural communities. So again, there seems to be the need for a sort of building in this climate change wild card, this sort of margin of error, both in terms of engineering specification and in terms of finance. I'm not a banker, so I wonder how that looks, and I suspect that development partners will have to help finance that kind of arrangement. Private sector finance will surely wish for clear clear figures in terms of economic return and reimbursement of commercial loans. So I imagine that issue is very much a subject for mixed financing or for concessionary financing from development sources. The Minister mentioned capacity. I think that's an issue for development partners to fund capacity. It's not easy to do options assessment across several sectors: water, energy, agriculture, and more. I mean, I think governments do it often behind closed doors because they wish to make decisions in a less transparent way, but also because it's a difficult thing to do. And I think that is an issue where donors could definitely provide capacity building support. I saw an example in Cameroon when I looked at a dam project last year of the bank not only proposing funding for the capital cost of the project, but also putting in substantial amounts of money for capacity building the environment ministry and the energy ministry for sector planning. So that seems to be an important line of support. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. Very